So I know it's been a while since I made a card design video, and since I'm really not as excited to play the game as much, I'm definitely more interested in just making videos of me talking about specific subjects, and more specifically card design since I enjoy that. And today I just wanted to have a general talk about Cavern of Souls, and why I think that Cavern of Souls is pretty poorly designed, or I guess you could call it lazy. I think it is one of those cards that is blatantly powerful and that is just kind of created to sell, I guess, in this case, where it was not so much focused on being on the balanced side of things. Now, I'm not saying that its effect is something that isn't good for the game or that it shouldn't be in the game. I just think it shouldn't be implemented in its current state into the game. And it's not that far off, I would say, but there are some pretty glaring issues. So I'm going to be talking about those. Over the course of this video, I'm going to start by talking about tech cards, and we'll go into a little bit of like the deck building aspect, or like the impact of a card like this in terms of deck building. And then I'll show off a few potential versions of the card that I think would just be better in terms of card design. So let's get started. Cavern of Souls is a land. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type. It adds colorless, or it adds 1 mana of any color. Add this mana only to cast a creature spell of the chosen type, and that spell can't be countered. So first, I want to talk about the category of spells/cards that have a specific type of effect, like Cavern of Souls. I call those tech cards. I mean, most people call them tech cards. They're cards that are created to counteract a specific mechanic, or counteract a specific game plan, or strategy, or archetype, and they do that usually through a very specific effect that targets that mechanic. In this case, we have the bypassing of counter magic through creature spells cast through this mana. And in other examples, we would have, potentially a creature that can gain indestructible, potentially a creature with hexproof, or a permanent with hexproof. We have protection to different colors. We have graveyard hate. We have potential exile of cards in a deck. There are many different things. So there's also, potentially counteracting enter the battlefield effects by preventing those from activating. There's a lot in Magic the Gathering that you can use to counteract specific mechanics. And that is really the beauty of a card game like Magic the Gathering with so many cards. There's almost always a way to counteract something that you might not like or that is too powerful. So what might be the problem with Cavern of Souls concerning its identity as a tech card? Usually tech cards come in the form of non-land permanents. I think that is very important. For example, we might have an artifact that can exile cards from the graveyard, like Hearse, for example. Or we might have a card like Doorkeeper Thrall that can counteract enter the battlefield effects, but it is a creature itself. Or there might be a specific spell that gives hexproof to another creature, but that will be an instant speed spell or a sorcery speed spell, in some cases very unlikely to be sorcery speed, but instant speed spell to protect your creatures. Same thing with indestructible. There are many types of spells in different forms that can counteract different types of effects depending on what you're looking for. But the key thing is that usually they are either one-time effects or they are non-land permanents. The power of this specific effect of bypassing counter magic through adding mana is extremely powerful. And as such, when it's tied to a land that can be activated multiple times over the course of the game, you need to make sure that it has a very clear downside. Otherwise, people will just be playing this in decks where they shouldn't be, in my opinion. A good example of this would be Atraxa Ramp, where they are trying to cast Atraxa, which is an incredibly strong enter the battlefield effect creature, also a very good creature overall in terms of stat line, and they're also trying to curve out their ramp on time with answers to aggro decks like sweepers to kind of stabilize. So what are the downsides of playing Cavern of Souls? Well, there's only one downside, and that is the fact that outside of casting creatures of the specific type, you're adding colorless to your mana base. And that might be a downside in specific scenarios, but overall, if you're playing around a specific spell resolving, that downside is not enough to make you actually consider not playing a card like this. For example, Atraxa Ramp will just never consider running 0 Cavern of Souls because the downside is simply not relevant enough. The fact that you can also choose any creature type means that it lessens the burden on your mana base even further, where if you want to cast a card, again illustrated by Atraxa, if you want to cast a card like the Dino, you can also just name Dinosaur, and you can cast a 3-mana 4/4. And that affects deck building in general, because usually tech cards should be going in your sideboard. If they're going in your main deck, it means you're expecting a specific type of archetype or a specific mechanic to show up, and you want to gain an edge immediately. But in those cases, usually the downside is that in matchups where those cards aren't relevant, you're taking a pretty sizable hit to your general, deck effectiveness. So there's a push and pull there where you can play tech cards in your main deck, but you'll be losing effectiveness against everything else. And I think that should be the sweet spot for tech cards, and they should fit perfectly in that specific role, I think, of being extremely good or just good in general against specific archetypes, depending on their power, of course. If the tech spell is less impactful, it can be more generally good, I would say. But the more you go to the extreme of power, the more you counteract a specific thing, the more of a downside it should have if you're going to play that card in your main deck. That doesn't apply to Cavern of Souls because the downside is simply not large enough at all. So what do I think could be done to Cavern of Souls to kind of bring it more in line in terms of its design? Well, I think there are a few obvious things that could be done in mixed and match to find the correct sweet spot. Of course, there's a lot of speculation going on, and there would have to be, in my opinion, ideally, testing in different forms to figure out the best case scenario for a card like this. Well, the first thing you could do would be to give the land legendary. Giving a land legendary means that there's a lot more consideration as to how many copies you want to run in your deck, and the downside being that if you draw multiple copies, you might be in a situation where you simply cannot curve out as easily. That is already a pretty big downside, but we can go one step further or potentially not give the land legendary, but let it enter the battlefield tapped. That means that you would be taking a significant tempo loss to gain the effect of Cavern of Souls. Another thing you could do is add a mana cost to the can't be countered ability. I think that's really interesting because that means that the player who wants to give their creature can't be countered has to commit more mana, which means that they lose out on potential tempo. And also, if their opponent doesn't have a counter spell, that means they have to sink more mana for basically nothing, which is really important. It means that there is a actual price to gaining an effect as powerful as can't be countered. Something even more extreme that might be able to be done would be to remove the colorless mana from the card itself, which means it would only be able to add mana of any color, spend this mana to cast a creature of the chosen type. It would no longer function as a general land. That might be way too far, but I'm just saying that is also an opportunity to test something out and see if that is more in line. That means that only decks that are tribal would be able to run this, and that is a little bit more interesting of a deck building restriction. And I'm sure there are a lot of other interesting things you could do this card to make it a little bit less powerful and a little bit more interesting in terms of deck building. But that is pretty much all I'm going to mention for today. And essentially, it's not that far off from being a land I would be more so okay with. It's just slightly too effective at what it's doing. And since it impacts an aspect of the game that some decks really heavily revolve around, I think it is slightly problematic in the current state that it exists in. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, and look forward to more card design talk. Maybe I'll cover something that I think is really well designed in the next video. Before I end this video, I just want to mention I have a second channel where I play a bunch of roguelikes, a bunch of deck builders, card games. You can go ahead and check that out in the description. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.